Hello everyone, my name is Wardah, and you're watching Crash Course World History. Today, class, we're going to be looking at ancient Egypt. Let's get started. So, the ancient civilizations sort of created this, or I should say developed this foundation for the later on empires that evidently fell. But overall, it is important to understand how ancient river valley civilizations and how their geographical features basically shaped each one. In favor of ancient Egypt was the Nile. Now, the Nile was a fairly easy, structured body of water that enriched ancient Egypt. The Nile was so down to earth that other river valley civilizations had a more difficult time maintaining their water systems. They needed more help and were therefore more labor intensive, while Egypt used a very simple irrigation system called basin irrigation. Basin irrigation is when farmers use floodwaters that fill up the earth and basically reuse them for their crops. It's like the floodwater that has fallen on the earth is sort of stored in a kind of ditch or hole that was made previously, so then the crops can soak it up properly. Now that we've sort of introduced the idea of the Nile and how agriculture really affected the farmers, we're going to sort of transition a little bit and talk about Egypt's society. Now, when talking about Egypt's society, it is important to take into key on how much the Nile sort of gave them an advantage. Egypt also enjoyed a much larger floodplain than most of the land to the south of them, known as Nubia, a civilization that landed on the south end of the Nile stretch. But we'll get back to Nubia in just a bit. Because of Egypt's large floodplains, they were able to take a better advantage, or head start per se, of the Nile's flooding, rather than Nubia, who didn't really get that advantage as much as Egypt did. Now, because Egypt had access to this sort of advantage, they gained a better agricultural society and were able to establish a more better livestock and food stock for the population that was rising at the time. If you think about it, Nubia is nothing compared to Egypt at this time period. It's obvious that Egypt has this higher echelon when put next to Nubia. Okay, moving along. Egypt and Nubia would become under the influence of the Mediterranean basin to the north and Saharan Africa to the south, because the Nile River links the two regions. It's kind of like when a car hits a raccoon, and then the raccoon becomes roadkill, and then roadkill collectors collect the roadkill, and then throw it into a machine and make mulch. That's why mulch smells bad. As I was saying, Egypt sort of, again, has this easy way out because of their geographical features. They have land designed for fertile, like they have a fertile crescent, so that provides a better essence of how they farm. And then you have Nubia, who has to really have a prepared field. They have to have irrigation set. They have to have, a lot of labor involved, while Egypt can easily get the work done. Usually, when studying history, we rely on past resources for guidance. For example, the Mesopotamian Empire that reigned before Egypt and Nubia sort of laid out a playing field, or set out a broad example for Egypt and Nubia to use. Now, by playing field, I mean they sort of laid the land out for them. Egypt and Nubia didn't just pop out from the ground. They had another empire. They had another civilization to base their knowledge upon. They already knew what was happening. Now they can apply that knowledge to their empire. It's this idea of the next empire, the next civilization. Sorry. Since Egypt and Nubia had such a dense population, it was decided that the need for formal organization of public affairs be put into play. Now this meant that they socially stratified their people because there were so many of them. There was this idea that because there's a big population, there needs to be social status. But on the bright side of Egypt and Nubia, they didn't really have a lot of foreign invaders come and attack them because their regions were surrounded by endless lands of desert. So they really didn't have that problem in ancient times, because who's gonna mess with someone who's in the middle of miles and miles of desert? I wouldn't do that. It's too much sand. But nevertheless, the need to maintain order and create community projects led Egyptians and Nubians to create states and recognize official authorities. With this in effect, many small kingdoms began to grow in early times. Okay, so historians sort of trisected ancient Egyptian history because it is just way too much history for one area. They just stole the spotlight for a really long time. Just goes on. Just so long. So, let's begin. So, we have the Archaic period, which is known as the Old Kingdom. Then we have the Early Kingdom of Kush, called the Middle Kingdom, and then we have the New Kingdom, which is kind of like the revived kingdom of Kush. So, did you get all that? We have the Archaic period, the Early Kingdom, and then the New Kingdom. But before we get into the different trisections and kingdoms of ancient Egyptian time periods, it's time for the open letter. An open letter to cats. One day I will have one, and that will be the greatest day ever. No, but really, in ancient Egyptian times, cats were called Mau, M-A-U, and they were very sacred to Egyptian people. Also, they were the first animals to be domesticated in the Middle Eastern region. Okay, back on topic. So, the Old Kingdom was filled with pharaohs whose powers were the greatest in all millennium. They ruled between 2660 to 2160 BCE. Now, it's important to understand that during the Old Kingdom, also known as the Archaic period, there was a lot of construction building. All the time there was construction building. That was the main focus point during this time. To be more specific, pyramids were being built continuously. Now, pyramids during this time were used for royal tombs. So say an emperor died, a pyramid would be built in honor for their tomb to be placed into it. It's pretty cool if you think about it. Instead of a little gravestone, you got a huge triangle. That's pretty cool. Okay, number 2 of the trisection that is set up for Egyptian time. It was called the Early Kingdom, also known as the Middle Kingdom, and the Early Kingdom was filled with a lot of tensions between Egypt and Nubia. You remember Egypt and Nubia? Egypt always got the higher status. But now there's a problem, because there was constant violence between them. There's obviously jealousy between them because Nubia isn't getting anything. Nubia wants something, and when power is granted to two regions and the other one's getting the most, there's obviously going to be conflict. So the pharaohs organized at least 3 military campaigns to Nubia during 3100 to 2600 BCE to keep them out. Even though Egypt and Nubia were having their problems, that doesn't mean that everything just became a problem. There were still different things being introduced. For example, Egypt had a stronger desire for trade with southern lands because Nubia was just coming out of nowhere. They obviously want to be involved in the trade route if Nubia already has something and is seeking for more power. So towards the end of the Old Kingdom, the Hyksos, a Semitic people, became a huge problem. They were like flies on a summer evening where you just want to walk, but they just keep bothering you. The Hyksos wanted to provoke the Nile Delta, so they came in from the north, and basically they wanted what they had. It was constant war, but finally Egyptian armies pushed them out of the Nile Delta and founded a powerful state known as the third section of the trisection of Egyptian history, known as the New Kingdom. So Egyptian imperialism began to flourish during this time. The New Kingdom was full of majority of the stuff we consider all of history in Egypt, because I'm sure all of you know who King Tut is, right? Obviously, because that's the first thing that comes to mind when we think about Egypt, King Tut. But he covered such a small portion of Egyptian history that he's kind of irrelevant, but he's not, because he was the youngest emperor to ever prosper in Egyptian society. So if you just put it into perspective for me, because Egyptian history isn't just one huge strip of history. It's a continuous process that slowly and gradually becomes greater and greater. Okay, so now that you've sort of got the idea of the different trisections and different kingdoms, sort of got an introduction to that, we're going to shift gears real quick and be focusing on Egyptian and Nubians' social status and cultural side of things. So both Egyptian and Nubian people built patriarchal societies that vested authority over public and private affairs in their men, meaning that men had the higher authority in all households and in domestic work. It was just men above everything. Now, men of lower class worked as agricultural laborers, potters, craftsmen, carpenters, or fishermen. And then overall, men and women were able to accumulate property, including the slaves. Now, that's pretty interesting because the abolition of slaves wasn't until the 1700s, 1800s. So it's interesting that slaves are able to be involved in this idea of having property and going through it. So, keep that in mind, that even though the social statuses are pretty common, slaves were able to own property, because that's how it worked. Alright, I'm going to sort of continue my rant for gender equality still, but this was the women's influence in Egyptian history. Nubian and Egyptian societies were far more in favor for women than Mesopotamia. In Egypt, women in royal families frequently served as part of the government. For young rulers, women also worked with policy and finding out ways to overthrow an emperor. That's pretty funny if you think about it. It's to end on a strong note, ancient Egyptian history sort of blends all together. You learn it all as one thing, when really it was just whole sections. It's like a whole pizza, and then you're just cutting different sections. We shouldn't blend Egyptian history because it's so long, So remember that Egyptian history was a process. You gotta love the process. That's all from us today. And remember, life is what you make of it. So make it great. See you next time on Crash Course World History.